Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Today we're going to start talking about soil fertilization and why that's so important in our forages. We get calls at the office all the time with people asking, I need to fertilize my pasture this year, what should I use? Trying to tell you what you should use on a pasture that we don't know anything about is like trying to give you a recipe on how to cook without knowing how much flour or how much milk or how many eggs you need. It's one of those things that it's really hard to do. Yeah, you can give you some general recommendations that are out there, and it might need about this much, but that doesn't give you the actual information you need to get the quality pasture. Fertilizer prices are already going up this year, and there's no telling what they're going to look like by the middle of hay season. If you're going to spend that kind of money to fertilize, why not make sure we're fertilizing correctly and putting out what your field actually needs? Lots of people call and say, oh, what's the average for our area? Today alone, I wrote on several different soil tests. For one pasture maintenance, I had one guy that triple 19 would actually work pretty well for. He needed 60 pounds of nitrogen, 70 pounds of phosphorus, and 60 pounds of potassium per acre. We can use triple 19 and get pretty close. I had another soil test report that we'll look at here in a minute that all he needed was 60 pounds of nitrogen. So depending on what you need, why would I tell you to go use fertilizer that you're just going to be pouring money down the drain? And that's why one of the first things we start with is a soil test. Your ground's only going to grow at the minimum nutrient available. So if your phosphorus is really low, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen we pour on that field, it's still only going to grow to that level of phosphorus that it has available to it. And so when we take the time to soil test, that tells us how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium you actually need so that we can get you a recommendation for your own field. And the biggest plus of it all is soil testing doesn't cost you a dime. All it costs you is a little bit of your time. When you go to soil test, we've got several probes at the office. This is a brand new one. It hasn't even been used yet, other than coming out in the field for today's video. It's really quick and easy to use. When we talk about how to soil sample, one of the first questions we get asked on soil samples is how many samples should I take? Theoretically, one of these boxes, when you pick them up from the office, they come flat. They're really easy to put together. They just come together at the bottom. They can hold about a quart of soil. This quart is going to represent up to 20 acres. If you've got a really nice 100-acre hayfield that's flat and pretty and all looks the same, you can pretty much divide that up into 20-acre spots and bring in those samples. But what if your pasture looks kind of like this one behind me and there's nothing even about it? Break it up in the way that's easiest for you. Look at those natural divisions that you already have. For this guy, he started cross fencing. And so his cross fence sections are smaller than 20 acres apiece. So we can use those sections as individual soil tests. Some people do the high side of a creek and the low side of the creek. Make sure you do something that's going to be easy for you to fertilize those sections separately if that soil test comes back and calls for it. When you look at the box, there's a couple things that you put on before you ever bring it to us. Basically your name and information and your sample ID. Whatever you name that sample, make sure you know what that means. I've got some guys that bring it in and they're labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. Make sure you know that 1 is the north side of your pasture and 4 is the south side of your pasture. Because I won't know that when it comes back in, and all we'll have is that name to look at. The other information that I need to know is found over here on the side of the box. We need to know how many acres that field was, what was the previous crop that was grown there, what's your goal of what you plan to grow. If you're doing something like hay, I normally run those for hay at 2 tons per acre production, 4 tons per acre, and 6 tons per acre production. So that way when it comes in, you can see where that price point is and what's going to be most affordable for you to reach your production goals. The other thing I need to know is, has this field been limed in the last 4 years? When we talk more about lime, it can take lime up to 6 months to really activate the soil, so we want to know the lime history of that field as well. When it comes time to actually take your soil sample, your whole field's not going to be exactly the same. There's going to be some differences, whether you've had cows on it or if you've cut hay off of it. We know our wildlife, like deer, come across our pastures pretty regularly. So one spot isn't going to be representative of the whole place. So when you go to take a sample, for every box we're going to take around 10 to 15 coarse samples to represent that area. And we're going to start wherever you start in the pasture. We're going to make a zigzag pattern around the whole place. This way we get several coarse samples. We'll mix it together in our bucket, pour what we can into our soil box, and that'll be our soil sample that we'll turn back into the office. We have these core samplers available at the office. You can come by and check one out. It makes it a little bit easier. This does give us a better sample than what a traditional shovel would do. We also want to make sure we don't just go out and dig one hole from one spot to try to represent the whole place. So when you start your sample, pick your place to start. Take your core. This plunger makes it easy. I always carry a bucket with me to drop my samples into, and then we'll take off across the field in that zigzag pattern to get the rest of our sample. One of the questions we get asked pretty regularly is, how deep should our soil samples be? Think about the ground you're growing on. For most of our pastures and forages, 3 to 6 inches deep gets us about everything we can do. If you've got a place that's really rocky, sometimes you can't go 6 inches deep, and that's okay. Do the best you can do, but the big thing is when you get your sample done, you're going to shake your bucket really good, make sure it's mixed up. And make sure your box is full to the brim. We want to make sure it's full, that way it ships well, our boxes don't come apart, and they have plenty of sample to work with once you get to the lab. Another factor to consider as you're pulling these soil samples, before you put it in your box, make sure that there's not a lot of grass or rocks or sticks on the top of that sample that might have gotten mixed in. Toss those to the side and make sure that your actual box of soil does just contain soil. When it comes time to decide whether or not to take soil samples, I always recommend taking samples. At the very least, we want to take new samples at least every 3 years to evaluate where that field is. But I also tell my guys that if you're doing a lot of work on your fertility, if you're putting fertilizer and lime out every year, why not go ahead and take samples every year so that way we can monitor your progress and know that we're doing what we need to do to keep going correctly. The other side of that coin is make sure you take samples at the same time every year. There are some changes depending on the seasons that could affect things like your pH level a little bit. So if you're keeping those records year after year, we want to make sure we sample at the same time every year. Once you have your soil test done, you'll bring these boxes back to the office. We'll send them off. Right now it's taking about 2 weeks to get those soil test reports back. I'll make some notes on them and we'll look at what that'll look like here in just a second. When it comes to soil testing, there's 2 key philosophies. One is to fertilize the crop, which means you're only putting out enough fertilizer for that crop for that year, and you're not doing any kind of soil maintenance. The other philosophy is to fertilize the soil. When you fertilize the soil, this time you're applying enough fertilizer to not just produce your optimum yield for the crop, but you're also putting that maintenance back into your soil and increasing your fertility to be better prepared for the upcoming year. At the University of Arkansas, we fertilize to the soil for all of our soil test recommendations. So that's important to understand on the front end. When you get your soil test report back in the mail, it's going to look something like this. You notice it'll have a couple things highlighted on it. So when we take a closer look at these sections, the key things you want to look at is what's your field ID. Remember I told you on your box, make sure you label it as something you know. Make sure you know which field 3 is on your place, because this is all that I know when it comes back. How many acres that's for, where your pH fell. On this one, his pH was 6.8, which is slightly acidic. His phosphorus was at 211 parts per million, which is considered above optimum. Potassium's at 133 parts per million, which is in the medium range. So at the bottom, when you look at recommendations, those were all high enough that he doesn't have a recommendation for phosphorus, potassium, or lime. Lime would have been recommended if that pH had been lower. But there always will be a nitrogen recommendation unless you have a lagoon base in your forage as well. So for this one, 60 pounds of nitrogen is recommended per acre. You can't go to the co-op and just buy nitrogen. You buy a source of nitrogen like urea. And so there'll be crop 1 notes. Apply the recommended rates of NP and K in spring when those nighttime temperatures are greater than 60 degrees for 1 week. This is a standard recommendation for all of our spring fertilizer recommendations. You don't want to let those warm grasses get started and jump like the warm temperatures we're having right now, feed them all their fertilizer, and then temperatures drop off like they just might next week and stun everything backwards. After those, I also put handwritten notes at the bottom. Like we said, you can't go buy 60 pounds of nitrogen, but you can go buy urea. And so to reach that 60 pounds per acre nitrogen, this producer will need 130 pounds per acre of urea. And then my signature will be on the bottom of these as well. So what does all that mean for you? Once you've got an idea of what you're going to need per acre, then we look at prices. I called the co-op today. These are the prices they had. Obviously, if you guys have been watching the market, you know these are changing pretty regularly, so I can't guarantee these will be the same next week. In fact, they kind of warned me they probably would go up by next week. So when we look at recommendations, lots of times I use urea, potash, and DAP for a phosphorus source. But there are lots of other options as well. Our co-op here in Malvern doesn't carry lime, but the Benton co-op does, and those were their prices today. And so the first example we used, he only needed a nitrogen source in urea, and I wanted to give you guys a little bit different option to look at as well. This is an example of a hay test that was done here in the county. It was done less than a couple weeks ago. And whenever I run a hay test, when we talk about goals, do you want to produce 2 tons per acre of hay, 4 tons per acre of hay, or 6 tons per acre of hay? This is a recommendation for the whole season, not on how much fertilize, but how much actual production of hay you're going to have in your crop. You'll see those crop notes are about the same, but it doesn't give a lot of room to make those notes. So I'll have an attached sheet where I actually type out those recommendations the same. That'll be right there beside it. So for this example, there's your 2 tons per acre for that field ID. This was a chicken house field. If I'd shown you this whole one, it would have been up there at the top. So the next step as a producer is deciding where is your price point worth your point of gain, depending on what your goals are for your hay fields. So for example, if you're looking at only producing 2 tons of hay per acre, you can get away with around $2,000 for that 20-acre hay meadow or hay patch, depending on how big your hay field is. Remember, we only run the boxes for 20 acres, so that's what I ran these calculations on. And when you do your whole place, if you want help doing the calculations for everything, give me a call and we can run these numbers for you as well. And these are, again, all based on the prices that were there today. Whereas if you want to jump from 2 tons of acre production to 6 tons, instead of costing you around $2,000, now it's going to cost you about $5,000. Can you sell enough hay at 6 tons per acre or save enough money on your feed costs, depending on what your goals are for your hay operation, to make up that difference in what it's going to cost you fertilizer? And so this is just some options you've got as a producer to kind of price compare. And if you've ever got questions, don't hesitate to give me a call and I can walk you through this as well. So why take the time to soil test? Why not just throw triple 19 out there and make sure you've got everything covered? Well, number one is we looked at fertilizer prices a minute ago and they're expensive. If you're that producer that only needed urea and you went and spent all that money on triple 19, that was money you didn't need to spend this year. The other thing is we want to correct those nutrient deficiencies in the soil, which is going to in turn improve our forage yields. We'll get better production. With more grass, that means we can turn more cows out there. When we increase our stocking rate, that's less ground we're going to have, which means more cows we could have, which means a bigger calf crop that we could have. And so as we allow those production improvements, all that can come back to soil fertility. Soil testing's free. There's no reason not to take the time to soil test to have those gains for your operation. If you've got more questions on soil testing, don't ever hesitate to give us a call. We also have this great page on our website that's forage management guides that talks about the importance of different fertility and our guide to soil testing as well. Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Next week, we're going to talk more about what those nutrients really mean when it comes to fertility and what your soil actually needs. We'll see you next Friday.